Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating, high-stakes, real-world case straight out of the Constitutional Court of South Africa. It's literally a legal drama that touches on the very foundations of a democratic society. We're going to explore exactly how a country balances the desperate need to fight rampant corruption with the absolute necessity of playing by the rules of its own constitution. So this explainer is all about power, limits, and what happens when the lines between government branches get seriously blurred. I'm absolutely thrilled to guide you through this, so let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. This quote from the Minister of Justice at the time perfectly sets the stage. Back then, South Africa was battling some extremely severe issues with corruption and unlawful conduct involving state institutions and, well, public money. The government essentially looked at the situation and realized, you know what, standard police work just isn't going to cut it here. They desperately needed a specialized, heavy-hitting tool to recover stolen funds and stop the rot in its tracks. They were determined to protect their newly formed democratic state from being hollowed out from the inside.
But right here is where we hit an incredible paradox, captured beautifully by the president of the Constitutional Court, Justice Chaskelson. He totally acknowledges that corruption destroys democracy and human rights, but he immediately points out the catch. And it's a big one. If you try to fight that corruption by breaking the rules of the Constitution, you are also destroying democracy. You simply can't save the rule of law by ignoring the rule of law, right? And that is the exact, incredibly delicate tightrope the Constitutional Court had to walk in this landmark judgment.
To make sense of how they actually pulled this off, we're going to unravel two distinct constitutional puzzles today. First, we'll look at the anti-corruption dilemma, then the separation of powers, followed by the judge's two hats. After that, we'll tackle the road accident fund, dive into state versus private money, and wrap it all up with the final constitutional verdict.
Part 1, the anti-corruption dilemma. To understand our first big puzzle today, we really need to set the stage for a brand new weapon the government built to fight crime under a 1996 act.
So in 1997, the president established the Special Investigating Unit, or the SIU. This was created with an incredibly noble purpose and, honestly, a massive scope. Just to give you an idea of the sheer scale we're talking about here, the evidence in the case showed the SIU was handling over 221,000 cases across all 9 provinces, with roughly 3 billion rand at stake. I mean, that is huge. It was this massive, sprawling operation designed to root out maladministration. But there was a catch. The way they structured its leadership created a completely massive legal dilemma.
Part 2, separation of powers. This dilemma brings us directly to one of my absolute favorite constitutional concepts, which really is the beating heart of today's explainer. The separation of powers. So this is basically the idea that the people who make the laws, the legislature, should be separate from the people who enforce the laws, the executive. And crucially, both of them must be completely separate from the people who interpret the laws, the judiciary. Now, what's really interesting here is that the South African Constitution doesn't actually have one single sentence that explicitly says, there shall be a separation of powers. No way. But the court established that this principle is deeply implied in the very structure of the document itself. And in law, an implied constitutional provision carries just as much weight as an express one. It's a real game changer. And this brilliantly illustrates how South Africa's specific model works when you compare it to others. Like in the United States, you have a very strict separation, right? The president and cabinet are totally separate from Congress. But in Australia and South Africa, they use a system of responsible government, where the executive branch is actually kind of blended into the legislature. The president or prime minister and the cabinet are drawn from, or at least answerable directly to, parliament. However, and this is the absolutely crucial takeaway here, in all 3 of these democracies, the judiciary is kept strictly separate. The courts must remain totally independent to keep the other 2 branches in check.
Part 3, the judge's two hats. And this leads us to the first major crisis of this case. The president of South Africa appointed a man named Willem Hendrik Heath to head the SIU for an indefinite period. The problem? Well, Willem Hendrik Heath was a sitting high court judge.
You see, as head of the SIU, Judge Heath wasn't just sitting behind some desk quietly reviewing paperwork. He was performing highly aggressive, partisan executive functions. Just think about it. He could question people under oath, authorize searches, and even use physical force to break down doors or windows to get evidence. And perhaps most importantly, he was literally tasked with instituting civil litigation on behalf of the state to get stolen money back. Now, these are the classic functions of police, prosecutors, and state attorneys, not a judge.
So the absolutely crucial point is this. You just cannot wear these 2 hats at the exact same time. The role of a judge is to be a neutral arbiter, totally detached, totally independent.
Meanwhile, the role of the SIU head is to be a partisan attacker, actively hunting down corruption for the executive branch. The Constitutional Court looked at this setup and flat out said, this is impossible. By putting a judge in charge of breaking down doors and litigating for the state, you completely compromise the independence required at the very heartland of judicial power. I mean, the public would look at this and start seeing the courts as just an extension of the police force, and you definitely don't want that.
Part 4. The Road Accident Fund. Now, while all of this drama was happening with Judge Heath's appointment, a second massive constitutional question was brewing in the background, this time involving a group of personal injury lawyers.
Here's what happened. In 1999, the president issued Proclamation R31. This officially authorized the SIU to investigate personal injury attorneys. The core allegation was that some lawyers were getting payout money from the Road Accident Fund on behalf of their clients, but then they were allegedly overcharging those clients on legal fees. This meant the victims weren't getting their full net compensation. Well, the Personal Injury Lawyers Association fought back hard. They argued this was a massive invasion of privacy. And honestly, more importantly, they claimed the SIU literally had zero constitutional authority to investigate what were essentially private billing disputes.
Part 5. State versus private money. To figure out who was actually right here, the Constitutional Court had to trace the actual flow of the funds. They basically had to ask, is this really public money being stolen from the state?
Let's move to and see how this builds across these 3 steps. It's like a giant puzzle. At step 1, the Road Accident Fund, which is a state institution, pays the compensation money to the attorney, who is acting as the agent for the accident victim. Then, at step 2, the lawyer holds that money in trust. And finally, at step 3, the lawyer takes their cut for legal fees and pays the rest of the net amount to the client.
Now look at what happens conceptually here, because this is fascinating. The court ruled that the exact moment the Road Accident Fund lawfully hands that money over to the attorney at step 1, the state's obligation is entirely fulfilled. Poof! That money instantly ceases to be public money. The state no longer has any legal interest in it whatsoever. Therefore, if the attorney overcharges the client over at step 3, they're unlawfully appropriating private money, not state money. And because the SIU's constitutional mandate under the Act is specifically to recover public money, they had absolutely no jurisdiction to investigate these private fee disputes. Hit the nail on the head, right?
Part 6. The Constitutional Verdict. And this brings us to the climax of our explainer today. So, how did the Constitutional Court actually resolve these 2 massive structural problems? First off, regarding the lawyers. The court declared the Road Accident Fund investigation immediately invalid. They pointed out that rolling up every single attorney and every single client into one giant, vague allegation completely violated the law. The act actually required specific allegations of serious harm to the public. The president's proclamation was basically just a broad fishing expedition to see if they could maybe kind of find some malpractice somewhere. Because it lacked specificity and, as we just learned, targeted private money, the court shut down the RAF investigation right on the spot. But what about Judge Heath? Well, the court absolutely ruled that a judge heading the SIU violated the separation of powers and was flat out unconstitutional, but they had a major practical problem on their hands. If they invalidated his appointment immediately, the entire SIU would instantly become headless. All those 221,000 anti-corruption cases might just collapse overnight, causing absolute chaos. So the court did something incredibly clever. They suspended the declaration of invalidity for exactly 1 year. This gave Parliament exactly 12 months to rewrite the law and find a non-judge head the SIU, ensuring an orderly transition without destroying the unit's vital anti-corruption work. Just brilliant. Which leaves us with this final, truly provocative thought. This entire case represents the ultimate tightrope walk of democracy. You know, when crime and corruption threaten the system, our first instinct is to just give the government maximum power to fight back, to literally let judges kick down doors if they have to. But the very moment we abandon structural rules like the separation of powers, we risk creating a state that can abuse its citizens without any consequence. So how do we balance giving the state enough power to protect the public while still protecting the public from the absolute power of the state? It's a question every single democracy must answer. Think deeply about that one, and thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today.